Welcome back to Get Your Voice Out There. I'm Roberta Chadis, and this show is really dedicated to people in the community who want to get their voice out there. And what better topic to talk about today is politics. So today we have Rich Rubino. He is a political author and a blogger with the Huffington Post. Welcome to Get Your Voice Out There.
Thank you so much.
Great to see you, Rich.
You as well.
Let's get right into it and find out how you even got involved with all of this political matter. Mm-hmm. What inspired you to get into politics?
It was more of a congenital interest than anything else. You know, people ask, where did it come from? Did something precipitate it? I don't really know. I think for a lot of people, you just kind of find your interest somehow. So I've always had this interest going back to when I was younger. I was always interested in the presidents and Congress, and I was watching C-SPAN when you come home from school, that type of stuff. So it just kind of happened. It just kind of sprung out, and I don't know what exactly precipitated it.
And then it led you to something on humor.
Yes.
Yes. So we might as well get right into your book, The Political Bible of Humorous Quotations
from American Politics. So I'll put it right here so you can see it.
Okay.
Yep. And it was actually sprang out of another effort. I had written a book a couple of years back called The Political Bible of Little-Known Facts in American Politics. And that was about kind of interesting facts that a lot of people don't know. Like the example I always use is that under the Articles Confederation Perpetual Union, which was the precursor to the United States Constitution, they actually had an office called the President of Congress Assembled. And that was actually, it was a one-year term. It had very little power. It was more of almost like the Speaker of the House, or it was more of almost a parliamentary system. But John Hanson, we could actually argue, under that system was the first president because he was the President of Congress Assembled. Some people might say, well, he wasn't President of the United States, and it's true, he didn't have executive powers. But that would be a perfect example. So that was the type of stuff that I was interested in at the time. And I did a book tour on that, and I did a lot of interviews. And I would say that the preponderance of the questions that people asked me were about the humorous quotations. There was only maybe 15% that were actually humorous, but people tended to kind of gravitate that way. It's a gravitational pull that way, so that put the idea in my head, well, why don't I write a book just about political humor per se, just about, you know, funny things that politicians have either said about each other, have been said about politicians, or just politicians have said in terms of, you know, as gaffes or faux pas. So that was kind of what precipitated this one.
And how do you go about your research on something like that? It sounds like a lot of work.
Well, a lot of it, it's funny, a lot of it, you know, somehow it's in the back of your mind someplace. So you have it in there, and it's a matter of trying to verify it. And a lot of quotes that you think people say, and this isn't only true in politics, this is true with what Aristotle says, what Einstein says, what Socrates says. A lot of what you think is true is actually either not said by the person or was said by somebody else. Perfect example was Everett Dirksen. Some viewers may remember, he was the Senate Minority Leader from Illinois back in the 1950s and the 1960s. And one of the quotes that's attributed to him is, "A billion here, a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about some real money." The problem is he never actually said that. He was on an airplane one time, and somebody sat next to him and said, "Oh, Everett Dirksen, you're the one." And he said, "You said that famous quote." And Dirksen looked at him and he said, "Oh, I never said that." He said, "You didn't?" He said, "No, but I never denied it. It was such a good quote." And it's funny. It's the first thing a lot of people think of whenever they see him is, you know, is that quote. So lots of times what you think people have actually said is not. And then sometimes while you're looking, you find other quotes and you say, "Oh, he said this too." And then you put that down, and then it's a matter of trying to get a photograph with it and trying to put them all together.
And do you have a couple of favorite quotes?
Oh, many, yes.
Yeah, let's hear a few of them.
Well, one of them, I'll tell you, one that I find fascinating was Marion Barry. He was a congressman from Arkansas, not the former mayor of Washington, D.C., but there used to be one who was a congressman from Arkansas, and from the 1st District of Arkansas, and he had probably one of the most southern accents of anybody in the United States Congress. There was a Republican, he was a Southern conservative Democrat, and there was a Republican named Adam Putnam. And Putnam came up and criticized Marion Barry, saying that essentially he didn't support a balanced budget. He wasn't criticizing Marion Barry specifically, but the whole blue dog or the conservative Democrats. So Marion Barry gets up and he says, "You know, I take offense to that." And he says, and he calls him, "And I say you're a howdy-doody looking Nimrod." And the funny thing is, when you look at a picture of him, he's got, you know, orange hair. He was about 30 years old at the time. He actually looks like a howdy-doody looking Nimrod. He does look like, not necessarily a Nimrod, but he does look like howdy-doody. So that was one that I thought was very interesting. Then there was Lyndon Johnson has some great quotes. One of them is he used to talk about there was a public hanging he used to talk about in Texas, and they said to the person right before they're going to hang him, they said, "You have 5 minutes to say to the crowd anything you want to say," and the guy says, "I have nothing to say." So someone in the back yells out, "You know what, if he's not going to say something, I want to say something." And he said, "I'm running for sheriff and I'd like to give a speech." Another thing that he said, talk about quotes in and of themselves. He liked to talk very down home, very folksy. So one time a person put a quote in by Aristotle again, and he looked at it and he said, "You know, that's a darn good quote. But you know, my audience isn't going to know who Aristotle is." He crossed it out and he said, "As my dear old daddy used to say."
Really? I mean, these are really funny.
Yeah, there was Gerald Ford who said, "I like to watch baseball on radio." He was one who had said, you know, it's funny, there was Fritz Hollings, who was a senator from South Carolina.
I'm just laughing at, I want to watch baseball on
the radio. Yes, yes.
My dad loved to watch baseball on the radio.
So you sit there with the radio there and you just watch the radio.
Well, no, he had the TV on too. But that's fine.
Fritz Hollings, a senator from South Carolina. At one point, he was debating his opponent. His opponent asked if he would take a drug test, and he said, "I'll take a drug test if you take an IQ test." And he said he was also the one that's in 1984 he ran for president, and part of his platform was essentially to raise the Social Security age and to establish the draft. Not very popular, and he gets about 1% in the New Hampshire primary, and he says, "Well, nothing happened to me on the way to the White House." Another fascinating Southern politician was Huey Long, and then also Edwin Edwards. And Huey Long is one a lot of people, you know, think back to. He was the one who said, you know, he's going to take a sledgehammer to the United States Senate. At one point, he asked Alvin Barkley, who was the Senate Majority Leader, what he thought of his speech. He said, "You know, you're probably the smartest nut I've ever met." You know, but Edwin Edwards, he was running for governor in 1983 against a guy named David Tren, and he was oftentimes criticized David Tren's intelligence. And one thing he said at one point, he said, "You know, this guy's so stupid it takes him an hour and a half to watch 60 Minutes."
So I have a question. Why is it that all of these politicians love to insult each other and throw these darts? What is it about being in politics and getting your voice out there? What a perfect opportunity there. Why is it? Why does that happen so much?
It's just like marketing, you know. If it wasn't effective, people would not do it. Everything would be completely civil if that was what was working. But there's obviously a market for that. You know, negative advertising, as much as people say that they hate it, it subliminally, if anything, has an effect on people. Otherwise, they wouldn't spend millions of dollars to run these ads. They'd run only positive ads. Positive ads don't have the effect necessarily that negative ads do. And if you go after somebody, you're going to get a lot more free media than if you just go up there and talk about how great your family is and what your background is. You see this with lots of times with for example, take Donald Trump versus John Kasich. John Kasich's running a very positive campaign. He runs a very, you know, he talks about what he's done in Ohio, what he did when he was in the United States Congress. Well, he's not getting full, you know, when he gives a half-hour address in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, he maybe gets a little 30-second snippet of it. Donald Trump, on the other hand, he will give an address, and CNN will run the entire thing. He's the only one candidate who gets the entire speech because people are just drawn to him. They're drawn to him when he insults people, when he says this person's, you know, he says, you know, he calls Ted Cruz Lying Ted, he calls John Kasich an absentee governor, he talks about individual reporters, and he says this guy, you know, he says George Will's a complete and total loser. this type of material, and people just absolutely eat it up. I mean, he's playing to a market, you know. There's a method to his madness. He's not just, this isn't necessarily, I think, just some sort of a candid way that he speaks. I think he's methodically thinking, this is what I'm going to say. And then he says it, and then he gets free media. You know, he doesn't have to spend a dime.
Exactly.
John Kasich does have to spend a dime, but, you know, his message isn't necessarily resonating because it's not as fascinating to people, whereas Donald Trump, the more you criticize somebody, the more media coverage you're getting. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is, isn't it? And he's a smart little cookie.
Oh yeah, there is a method there.
Now, since we're talking about that, are there some tips that you'd like to give to our audience? Anything that we should be looking for in an election year to make a better choice to look at these candidates and really get to the meat of what they're saying?
Well, I would say what they're saying. I would not listen to what they're saying at all, because well, when you're saying with any message that a candidate is propagating themselves, they're probably not going to say, well, I'm good in this area, but this area, we don't really know very much. When it comes to the budget, if in case he says, well, I'm good in balancing the budget, but on foreign policy, I don't know very much. Candidates aren't going to say this. If you listen to a candidate's speech and go to their website, everything is great, So I wouldn't listen to what the candidates actually say. And usually, by the way, they're not necessarily lying. Usually there has to be some truth in what they're saying, but it's usually a technical truth. Like the perfect example is Mitt Romney, when he always talked about when he was governor, he said that he closed a $3 billion budget shortfall that he inherited, and he said he did it without raising taxes. Okay, on the face of it, no, he said well, that may be true, but what he did was he raised fees, or he cut local aid to municipalities, so municipalities ended up raising property taxes. So what he says directly, that's true. But then if you learn a little bit more about it, what he did is technically true, but there's more to the story, and that's usually what there is. Yeah. It's really best to go to some sort of independent political source to get your information, or to just to listen to it. But you have to listen to something with a discerning mind. You can't listen to something and say, oh, that's a really good idea, because they're probably saying whatever they're saying, thinking that it's like, you can either say, when you're running for office, you can make all the promises you want, and then as soon as you get there, you can say, well, Congress wouldn't go along with me. So I mean, there's a lot more to it. If a candidate has a very modest proposals, then that probably means that they're not getting much coverage. It's not very sexy. But for example, when Bernie Sanders talks about single-payer health care, you have to think, well, okay, but how is he going to get that through a Congress where you need essentially a filibuster proof, which is 60 votes in the United States Senate, to support him on that? How is he going to get Republicans to support him on that? Donald Trump, when he talks about, building a wall, he calls it a beautiful wall on the U.S.-Mexican border and having the Mexican government pay for it. Okay, how's he going to persuade the Mexican government to pay for it? Is it his persuasive skills? Is he going to threaten an invasion? I mean, what's underlying? It's very easy also to just listen to somebody and just listen to him and say, yeah, that guy makes sense. Well, there's more to making sense. You have to look at the resume. You have to look at their experience. I mean, the guy at the coffee shop down the street may make sense, but I wouldn't necessarily think that he should become the president. There's a lot more, and part of it is resume. Part of it is who's going to surround him. So you really kind of have to listen. It's really, the devil's really more in the details than this kind of just their generally what they're speaking about. So.
Wow. My head is spinning, but I do want to mention to our audience that you're a blogger with Huffington Post.
Yes.
And perhaps that is a good source of information for people to read more about.
Yeah, I think my analysis, I try to, it's more nonpartisan. So a lot of people that you read in the Huffington Post or in other sources, do have some sort of an agenda. I just try to analyze. I try to analyze this election versus past elections, or try to analyze what this politician, how he's similitudes to previous politicians, that type of thing. So, I don't necessarily think from what I write you can necessarily learn which candidate's best, but you can learn what the historical context is more than anything else.
And that's important. And you were talking to me earlier about the comparison of what's going on now.
Yeah.
Let's
fascinating.
Hear a little bit about that.
A lot of people are saying, well, Donald Trump, is he inimitable? Is there anybody like him? Well, the closest I can find is actually goes back to 1896. And in 1896, here's the scenario that essentially you had. The Democratic Party was actually founded as a conservative party. They were founded as a supporter of free trade. They were a supporter of less government services. The Republican Party later came on as kind of a liberal alternative. But anyways, so Grover Cleveland was president in the 1890s, 1885 to 1890 to 1889. Then he came back from 1893 to 1897. And the second term, there was a depression, the Panic of 1893. And Cleveland absolutely refused to use government services or to advocate government services to alleviate the depression. As a matter of fact, there were people that came all around the country, from Steel Country, and came to Washington to protest and said, "Please, Mr. President, do something." So this was a Democratic president. So when he ran for his party, the Democratic Party, was in the midterm elections was up for election, they lost a record-setting 127 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. That's more than any other midterm election that a party's lost. Just by comparison, in 1994, the Democrats, when Bill Clinton was president in '94, they lost 52 seats, and that was considered a complete watershed. It was the Gingrich Revolution. This is 127 seats, so Cleveland was very unpopular. By 1896, there was really a movement within the Democratic Party. Cleveland was still saying, we're going to stay on the gold standard, the government's not going to do anything. He even said in natural disasters, the federal government does not have the power to essentially send money to alleviate national disasters. So there's this 36-year-old two-term congressman, orator, named William Jennings Bryan, who gets up there at the convention and talks about a cross of gold. Men should not be tied to a cross of gold. And he just galvanizes the crowd. It's an absolutely galvanizing moment of Democrats, because they're essentially at this time, there's really becoming a chasm within the Democratic Party. There was a new bloodline in the Democratic Party, which was essentially liberal. William Jennings Bryan was really the first liberal Democrat by the contemporary terms. Mm-hmm. He had issues that were irreconcilable with the Democratic Party. He wanted a graduated income tax. He wanted more government spending. He wanted more social services. Mm-hmm. He was against the gold standard. He supported bimetallism. He wanted the idea that you would have both gold and silver in the currency, and he thought that that would alleviate the Great Depression. This was an issue at the time. I know it's not an issue necessarily to contemporary times.
Exactly.
But at any rate, so he gets in there and he actually wins the Democratic Party nomination. Irreconcilable differences. Now think about today. You have Donald Trump. You have three issues. You have international trade. The Republican Party. George W. Bush talked about opening up borders. He talked about opening up trade, opening up markets. That's that Paul Ryan says that. Mitch McConnell, the Republican high command, I'll say that. Donald Trump says, let's put a 45% tariff on Chinese goods imported into the United States. He says, I'm against NAFTA. I'm against Trade Promotion Authority. He says, I'm against most traders. I'm against giving most favored nation status to China. I'm against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So he also, on foreign intervention, he says he was against the Iraq War. He said it destabilized the Middle East. This is completely opposite of the prevailing orthodoxy on the Republican Party. When George W. Bush was president, we invaded Iraq. Only one Republican in the entire United States Senate voted against him, and that was Lincoln Chafee, and he actually became a Democrat later. And the other issue is immigration. Mitt Romney only garnered 27% of the Latino vote in the last election. That was down from about 40% that Bush had garnered. So the thought in the Republican Party was essentially that they need to do more to try to bring Latinos into the party, and they were talking about immigration reform. Well, Donald Trump said, let's build a beautiful wall, between the U.S. and the Mexican, and he's talking about having a complete shutdown of Muslim immigration to the United States. Those are three countervailing ideologies, which he is completely different from with the political party. Right. So what happens in 1896? Did the party stick with somebody who was so different? Well, actually, a lot of people didn't. They formed what was called the New Democratic Party, and John M. Palmer, who was a United States Senator, who was 79 years old, got that nomination that year, and they essentially were the Democratic Party of Grover Cleveland. And they advocated what Grover Cleveland advocated. And the New York Times actually endorsed them, and they said that essentially the doctrinaires of the Democratic Party under Cleveland were so much different under Bryan were so much different that they could not support him. They had supported Democrats in the past. So Grover Cleveland himself would not support William Jennings Bryan. Grover Cleveland supports John W. Davis. Supports John Palmer. And Palmer that year, you know how much support he got? Despite all these endorsements, less than 1% of the vote in that new party. And it's fascinating because the Democrats, their strategy, those who supported Palmer, was not to completely egress from the Democratic Party. It was to reform the Democratic Party, to bring it back rather to where it was before, and to come back in 1900 and to try to run again and to kind of recapture it. So they try to come back in 1900, the establishment of the Democratic Party. What happens again? William Jennings Bryan wins again. Then in 1904, as economic times were a little bit better, actually it was interesting. William Jennings Bryan didn't get the nomination that year. Instead, they went to a very little-known New York district judge named William Parker, who actually won the nomination that year. And he was conservative. He was back in the Cleveland tradition. And William Jennings Bryan said, nobody should support this person. So what do you have? You essentially, in the Republican Party at the time, you now have two ideologies. You have the conservative ideology. A lot of them had supported William McKinley, who actually supported the gold standard. And then you have the more liberal faction of the Republican Party. The Democrats, the exact same thing. It's all you have the Alton Parker more conservative bloodline, and then you have the conservatives, and then you have the liberals in the Democratic Party. So both parties, up until about 1980, had a liberal and a conservative bloodline. that were extremely powerful, both of them. I mean, they were Southern Democrats. A lot of them were responsible for the Armed Services Committee, folks like Richard Russell or Charles Stenholm on the Agricultural Committee. They used to call them the Aggies because they were all on the agricultural committees. They had a lot of power, very conservative. You don't necessarily have that now, but that's really began the process of having both a liberal and a conservative wing in the party. What you have now, today, in the United States Congress specifically, is based on the way they've gerrymandered the districts, people being primaried out. You no longer have Democrats, for example, that represent districts that went for Republican presidential candidates or vice versa. I mean, you used to have someone like Gene Taylor, for example, who represented the 4th District of Mississippi around Biloxi, St. Louis Bay, very conservative district. He was a Democrat. This is a district that would go 68% for George W. Bush. He's since lost his re-election. He's no longer in there. Chet Edwards, for example, represented Waco, Texas. Waco, Texas, when George W. Bush was president. Crawford, Texas. George W. Bush got 70% of the vote. By the same time, Chet Edwards was winning with 53% of the vote. Chet Edwards since lost his re-election, so he's gone. So now here's the congressional district where Barack Obama did the poorest that the Democrat represents is probably the last really remaining conservative Democrat, Colin Peterson, and that district in Minnesota went 54% last time for Mitt Romney. So it wasn't 60%, 70%. So you no longer have that. On the contrast, on the Republican side, there's really only one congressional district, and that's in Illinois, suburban Chicago, where Robert Dole represents, and not Robert Dole, but Robert Dole, and that district went 58% last time for Barack Obama. So you no longer have that. So as a result, you have this ideological polarization, ideological homogeneity within both parties, which you really didn't have for a long period of time.
It is very complicated. The people who end up voting in the end, really, that's where you see it. You can't really judge what's going on. Well, you have to. What's going on in the pre-work.
Yeah,
But I can see it's all building up to a nice crescendo, and hopefully we'll have some positive results this year.
It's going to be, well, it's it's really a fascinating election.
We haven't really talked anything about the Democratic side.
Yes.
A little bit on that. And I noticed that in your book you had a couple of quotes that go way back that refer to Hillary and Bernie and even Donald Trump in your book.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't think I have any Bernie Sanders. I know for Hillary Clinton, I know that trying to think what I have her. I do know one thing that's interesting about her is that when she was in high school, and then when she was a freshman at Wellesley College, she was head of the Young Republicans, and she was supporting Barry Goldwater in 1964, a very conservative Republican candidate who was running that year. Now, I don't really do much with Donald Trump other than, I know right around 2000 when he was considering running for the Reform Party nomination, he was essentially saying that the Reform Party, this is the time when Pat Buchanan won the party's nomination. I think he compared him essentially to Hitler and to a Nazi. And he was talking about at one point about how the Republican Party had not done enough to support the Mexicans, for example, Latinos. It's an interesting change of pace. But I will say on the Democratic side, what you're having is really a classical battle. There's always the intellectual bloodline of the Democratic Party versus the more or less blue-collar wing. What you've had, this goes back, in 1968, you had Hubert Humphrey, who was the blue-collar candidate, versus, say, Eugene McCarthy. Eugene McCarthy represented usually college-educated or people in college, economically more upscale, and they're more or less they're interested in foreign affairs, for example, whereas somebody like Hubert Humphrey, that's more the bread and butter issues, it's more economics, it's more, lots of times, this wing of the party tends to be more or less economically nationalist. They're very afraid of losing their jobs to trade agreements, for example, the steel industry. In 68, you had that dynamic. 72, you had George McGovern, who was kind of the candidate of the liberal intellectual, versus Ed Muskie and Hubert Humphrey again, who was more or less the candidate of the establishment. But what's interesting this time around is there's always a movement within the establishment to kind of quell any sort of insurrectionist candidacies. In this case, you have Bernie Sanders. So you ask the question, are there any examples when an insurgent has actually won the nomination? Usually they don't. But there are two examples, 72 and 76. In 1972, you had the scenario where George McGovern, he announced in 71, he was way down in the polls, about 200 to 1 shot. He was not considered a major candidate, but he started harping on, being full-fledged against the Vietnam War and saying that he would essentially bring every troop home, a complete withdrawal. Most candidates were more or less somewhat in the middle. They would say we're going to end the war, but they wouldn't necessarily how. They say how. They would equivocate a little bit. So George McGovern that year ends up ends up doing extremely well in New Hampshire. He lost to Ed Muskie, but Ed Muskie was from neighboring Maine, and he had made a few faux pas during the campaign.
Right.
So you remember he was, right, there was,
Yeah.
it's funny, there was actually the Nixon campaign, the dirty tricksters in the Richard Nixon, the Republican president campaign, actually planted a letter in the New Hampshire Union Leader that year. And in that letter, they said that this was a person who said that he had asked, and this never actually happened, but he said that he had asked Ed Muskie, you come from a state with a lot of, with very few African Americans. How are you going to represent the African American community? They said, oh, well, we don't, but we have a lot of Canucks. And of course, Canuck is a pejorative term toward Canadians. So people ended up. So at any rate, people ended up believing that he had said that. So he goes in front of the Manchester Union Leaders headquarters, and also William Loeb at the time, the publisher of the paper, had said some not nice things about his wife, for example, and he ended up, speaking about how he was offended by it, and he said, did he cry, or was it just the snow that came right here? Who knows? But at any rate,
who knows?
That really precipitated the enfeeblement and eventually the end of that campaign. But George McGovern ended up really crusading with the liberal voters, and his train roll just kept steamrolling, and the party establishment was trying to stop him. And there was one last-ditch effort at the convention. And there was Henry Scoop Jackson, a more conservative, at least he was liberal on economic issues, more conservative on foreign policy issues, was really the only candidate who had not, he suspended his campaign, but he didn't actually leave the race. So there was a little-known governor of Georgia that year named Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter got up and spoke. He was leading the Anybody But McGovern movement, and he said, why don't we nominate Scoop Jackson? That never happened. McGovern got the nomination. McGovern ends up losing 49 states. He only wins Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. Even, most Democrats who support him would say, like Lyndon Johnson did, well, I've always supported the nominee, so I'm going to support you. But nothing flattering about McGovern whatsoever. It was a very pro forma endorsement. But Carter learned something from that, because Carter himself wanted to run for president in '76, and he saw how the way that George McGovern had inspired the grassroots. So right around '74, '75, at a time when they took a poll, the Harris Interactive organization took a poll of 35 potential Democratic candidates. He didn't even register. He wasn't even on the list. So he really, he works the grassroots. His wife, Rosalind, would literally go into radio stations and say, I'm Rosalind Carter. I'm the wife of the former governor of Georgia who's running for president. Would you like to interview me? She went to 41 states doing this. That's how, really primitive this campaign was. But it ended up working. And all of a sudden, Jimmy Carter, he started in the Iowa caucuses. He came in second uncommitted. Then he won in New Hampshire. And all of a sudden, the Democratic Party is saying, we have somebody who's not beholden to us that might actually get the nomination. So they started to panic. And Jimmy Carter ended up winning all these primaries. And actually, it came down at the end toward Pennsylvania, where Scoop Jackson won Pennsylvania. Lost Pennsylvania to Carter, and then Carter ended up, getting the nomination. And then the Democratic Party. One last thing, Everett Harriman, who was the former governor of New York, later said, I don't know how I got the nomination. I know everybody. I don't even know this guy.
So, Rich, I think you have lit a fire under our audience. Give us one or two places where our audience can reach you or find you.
Yep.
And I know one of them is maybe Amazon.
Yep, you can certainly get it. It's called, the most recent book is The Political Bible of Humorous Quotations from American Politics. It's also The Political Bible of Little-Known Facts in American Politics and Make Every Vote Equal, What a Novel Idea. They're all available certainly at Amazon.com, so you can certainly order them there. And you can also just, if you Google my name, Rich Rubino, R-U-B-I-N-O, and you can certainly get any articles that I've written on the Huffington Post, or you can see some of the interviews, or find me on Facebook or Twitter or any other sources like that.
That's great. And I am delighted to have had this discussion, because I think it opened up a lot of different ways to look at the political scene.
Yes.
Certainly don't believe what you hear.
No, just like anything else. There's one side and there's another side, and 99% the truth is somewhere in the middle.
So thank you very much, because you lightened it up a little bit. I'm Roberta Chadis with Get Your Voice Out There. We'll see you soon.